Tonight, I'm really excited to announce our speakers. We have, instead of just one speaker, we're doing it a little bit differently this time. We have a panel of folks from the Washington Resource Conservation and Development Council, who are also involved with the Washington Prescribed Fire Council. We have Ryan Anderson, Executive Director of the Resource Conservation and Development Council. We have Reese Lolley and Kara Karboski. And I won't take up time with intros because Ryan is going to do that for us. So I will get things started and pass the mic off to Ryan Anderson. Ryan.
Great, yeah. Thank you, Cy, and thank you, Matthew, for having us tonight. Yeah, again, my name's Ryan Anderson, and I'm the director of the Washington Resource Conservation and Development Council. And to save us time, we can just call us the RCMD tonight. We've been working on programming related to learning to live with wildfire for some time now, for maybe 8 to 9 of the last years, and many of you out in the audience have probably been experiencing increased impacts from wildfire. Whether it's increased smoke incursions or perhaps I don't want to not acknowledge that maybe some people have experienced loss of homes or something else of value, such as a landscape or a special place is burnt during the last several years, and there's been an increase in impacts from wildfire. And just recently, there's more news on wildfire. In the major news outlets, UN, United Nations released a report that wildfire due to climate change and other factors is expected to increase significantly, up to 50% over the next decades. So it's a relevant topic, and to those of us that like places like the Cowiche Canyon lands and the shrub steppe and the forests of Eastern Washington, it's a very relative topic. So I'm grateful to be able to talk about it tonight with the folks some of the folks I work with. So on that next slide, Reese. So a bit about the Washington Rcmd. So we're a nonprofit, and we're home based here in Yakima. We have staff and members kind of throughout the state, but our current mission is providing leadership on issues of regional significance by facilitating the planning, coordination, implementation of initiatives which promote a sustainable rural lifestyle for current and future generations. And kind of what that means, and really in summary, is we connect communities and connect Washingtonians with solutions to complex natural resource problems like wildfire. And salmon recovery, for instance. So two of our major programs right now, real highlight programs for us, is the Yakima Tributary Access and Habitat Program. That's one of our non-fire related programs. That's connecting the tributaries of the Yakima River by helping private landowners with fish passage and screening of their irrigation diversions, and then fixing up the riparian zones in our project areas. Working in partnership with Bonneville Power Administration, State Fish and Wildlife Conservation Districts, and private landowners. So that program's celebrating 20 years of success this year. They've connected well over 200 miles of stream for fish access in the Yakima Basin. It's a real neat project. I'd invite people to check it out on our website. Another keystone program we have is the Washington State Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, and that is a network of communities and agencies and people and organizations learning to live with wildfire better. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about fire adapted communities as we go on tonight. And we do a lot of fiscal sponsorship with our organization. So through fiscal sponsorship, we support the Washington Prescribed Fire Council, the Kittitas Fire Adapted Communities Coalition, the Chumpstick Wildfire Stewardship Coalition in Leavenworth, and Fire Adapted Methow Valley up in the Methow Valley. And we also provide coordination and fiscal sponsorship for the Taposh Sustainable Forest Collaborative, which is a group of 3 agencies, the Nature Conservancy and the Yakima Nation, working in collaboration to better manage the landscape of Eastern Washington dry forest in the Yakima River Basin, Natchez River Basin. So let's see, next slide, Reese. So, related to wildfire, there are federal, state, and local strategies for preventing, preparing for, responding to, and recovering from wildfire. And a lot of the work that we do here at the Washington Rcmd and with all the partners that we work with is really helping to lift up the voices and the needs of local communities, lift up the needs of the landscape across kind of the artificial boundaries that we create with jurisdictional boundaries or private land boundaries or whatever boundaries, sometimes cultural boundaries or language boundaries, but we work to get folks working across those boundaries for better wildfire outcomes, better outcomes for communities, better outcomes for the landscapes. Tonight, we're going to focus on kind of how we got here, say the landscape, a little bit of the climate, a little bit about our behavior, human behavior, where we want to live. We're going to talk about that and how it sort of all relates to this wildfire challenge. I'm really lucky to have good colleagues and good friends to help with the presentation, especially Reese and Kara. So Reese Lolley, he's the Washington Rcmd board president. He's got decades of experience with wildland fire and ecological science, working with the United States Forest Service and the Nature Conservancy here in Washington. He's past president of the Washington Prescribed Fire Council. He's currently the treasurer of the Prescribed Fire Council. And, I've just really been very lucky and fortunate to work with Reese the last, 8 or 9 years now on developing programs for fire adapted communities, prescribed fire, resilient landscape work. And, he's one of those people that has probably, I don't know that there's another person that's contributed more to landscape and community resilience in Washington. So we're really, really grateful to have him here tonight and to talk about this. And then Kara Karboski is one of our staff members here at the Washington Rcmd. She's our fire, community, and landscape coordinator. And she does a lot of coordination work for the Washington Prescribed Fire Council. She helps us with the Washington Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. She and Reese and others they brought the first prescribed fire training exchange to Washington State, and since then have completed several what we call TREXs, training exchanges, that have trained hundreds of wildfire practitioners and gotten hundreds of acres treated with prescribed fire here in Washington. So Reese is going to deliver our main presentation this evening, and then Kara is going to talk a little more specifically about prescribed fire. And this presentation that Reese is delivering is one that we co-developed with our partners Sasha Mama, Nuestra Casa, Cafe Wenatchee, and the Latino Community Fund of Washington State, along with the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. So you'll see in the presentation, the slides, that we have Spanish and English on the slides, and that's because we want our learning material to be available to as many people as possible. And I'm gonna also say that this presentation and a lot more learning materials available on our website, fireadaptedwashington.org. So I might be like throwing websites into the chat as people speak, because there's some great resources out there if you want to take a deeper dive. So I'm going to turn it over to Reese for the main presentation, and just want to express my gratitude for having us tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Cy and Matthew, for hosting this, and for all of you showing up tonight. So I'm excited to be here tonight and to share and have a conversation really about fire and our communities, our community, and the ecosystems that we live in and around. So, and how blessed we are relative to living in the shrub steppe, up to dry forest, and to cold forest in the just 30 miles away up White Pass in the Cascade Mountains. So tonight, I just want to give an overview of, and just working through the, there we go. Really, some of the objectives tonight is to really kind of explore the history and role of wildfire in our landscape, from where we live in Yakima, or wherever you may be, up into the high range of the Cascades. So through dry forests and up into the cold montane forest. Understand a little bit more of some of the drivers and behind the increased wildfire frequency and severity that we're seeing. Understand the risk of wildfire to communities, some elements of that, of how wildfire clearly is affecting communities in a negative way, but also how we might better use fire and have that historical context and better use fire into our future to help protect our communities and to increase the health of the ecosystems and the species that we care about. So with that, just, you know, thinking a bit really about through our history, so for time and millennia, fire has been a part of the ecosystems of Washington, nearly every ecosystem in Washington in slightly different ways. And fire has been brought to those ecosystems through lightning, ignitions, but also before pre-European contact, Native Americans, indigenous peoples used fire to manage food crops, wildlife, multiple elements of using fire and managing fire in the landscape. So I think it's an important component of thinking about the history and where we live and with fire. These two photos represent really forests that are just near us out of Yakima in the foothills, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir forests. And this two photos here were taken actually in Montana, but very similar forests to our dry ponderosa pine, Douglas fir forest here in Washington. And it represents a history where fire played a role in the sense of this ecosystem and how the ecosystem has changed over time. So the interaction of humans excluding fire starting in about 1910, where we made a decision basically that moving forward, you know, there were discussions about the role of fire early in the 19th century, but ultimately we decided that we needed to exclude fire, and fire was bad. And from that, over the years, and how we managed forests and also our rangelands or shrub ecosystems had that perspective of excluding fire. And so part of the result is, at least in our forest or dry forest, some of the large fire-resistant trees were used to really build the West in our economies in the early 1900s, and left with the exclusion of fire much denser forests with smaller trees that are less fire resistant. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And then if we're in also the context of shrub steppe, where we have an ecosystem where early pre-European, you think about some of the species that now are new species in the shrub subsystem, like cheatgrass and some other annuals, that create a scenario where it has changed the fire regime or the relationship of fire of those grasses and shrubs. So now, interestingly enough, in our shrub ecosystems, shrub steppe, now we have we really have too much fire because of the way cheatgrass and other annuals carry fire in the ignition sources that we have now today. Whereas in our forest types, we have too little fire from a historical perspective. So this is just a cartoon of looking at really a forest over time and how the relationship with fire. in this case, we're a more frequent fire system. So here, every 20 or so years, 5 to 20 years in a ponderosa pine Douglas fir system, fire would come through, and mostly surface fire, as you see in this cartoon, not really climbing up into the crowns of the trees. The larger trees are fire resistant bark, but also thinned the understory as it came through more frequently. So here's an example of 40 years. And the other thing that fire is doing, that low intensity frequent fire, is creating an ash and mineral soil type of situation where a lot of these trees can start to regrow in the forest. And so creating scenarios and also more sunlight to the forest floor. And these fires happen in different mosaic ways in a landscape and in stands. So, occasionally some large trees would be taken out, but again, fire frequently maintained this regime of growth and vegetation. And many of the understory plants, basically all have in these forests, drier forests, have adaptations to fire, and many of them actually require fire. So from the wildlife perspective, there's this cycle of where in a larger landscape that was we went over was kind of more at a small patch or a stand where there's frequent fire. But that is replicated across the landscape. And so there's patches of unburned and then burned. And the burned part component creates different habitats. So you'll have situations and scenarios where different plants and animals are adapting to those situations of more frequently burned in areas that haven't been burned in a longer time period. And from black woodpeckers to different types of woodpeckers where snags are created through fire. We have scenarios of more nutrient replenishment through the burning, and many wildlife have adaptations from either when a fire is coming through to burrow underground, to escape fire, to moving across the landscape. So clearly some animals are injured or die from fire, but typically, it's not all in the whole landscape, but in different parts of the landscape. And historically, too, these elements of there's been studies that looking at how fire has actually improved fish habitat through these cycles of nutrient replenishment into streams, and also resetting some of the geomorphic or the way the stream structure works as well, and also dead wood and other elements for stream function. So that relationship. This really is, in so many ways, trees can tell us, are really storytellers. And this is a slice of a ponderosa pine tree, fire-resistant tree. And the rings, as in every tree, as you can see in this slide, indicate basically for every ring, there's an annual year of growth. So you can tell the age of a tree. What's also interesting is if you can see the outside edge on the left of your screen, if you see the color of that is black and is actually charcoal. The tree actually has been burned, and where you see the curves and the arrows here and the dates is showing basically where it was recording low intensity fire. So the tree survived the fire. And so from this, we can get fire histories and better understand the relationship of fire in different forest types. And so here, this tree dates back to 1758. And you can see that we can't really, maybe you can read the dates, every 5 to 15 years, And this is a tree cookie that came out of just outside of Wenatchee in that area. So very similar to about a Yakima, some of the ponderosa pine and fire regimes of our area of every 5 to 20 years that fire was frequent in these types of forests. We can also see as we get into about 1910 in this area that to where this cookie was taken up moving forward. So thinking about European settlement and when we really had a strong fire and implemented a policy of fire exclusion, we can see that there is no fire scars, that we excluded fire from the landscape quite successfully. Also think that what was happening in the 1900s, and think about Yakima or other cities in the sense of development of the West. And so there wasn't really a fire pressure. To some degree, there was fire pressure, but not to the degree that we're seeing currently, right? In the sense of how we're adapting and thinking about how we're building communities over time. It was more of a much more of a less or fire-free time period. So with fire exclusion, and especially in dry forest, but in many vegetation types, you get more a density of more trees in forest types. You get more fuel, basically, and you get the arrangement of fuel that's in a way that if you think about a fire starting on the surface here, and that's typically what happens, and think about how, looking at this cartoon, how other trees really would work as a ladder for the fire to go up into the canopy and the crown of the trees and burn much hotter in this situation and kill a lot more of the fire resistant trees, torching all the way up into the tops of those trees and killing them. So this is much more of the situation we have in many of our forests because we've excluded fire, removed a lot of the large fire resistant trees out of the system. And one of the reasons why it is more difficult to manage fire at this point in time, and we're having more impacts to some of these ecosystems. So, again, we were very successful up until the 80s of excluding fire and really not having much of a debate about how we better live with fire and use fire. Up until around many large fires, in the state, clearly, and this is not up to date for the last few years. But it was really in 14, we had a record wildfire acre year, but in 2015, the year following, it doubled the number of acres in Washington. And that was when there was really a shift in our thinking in Washington about how we really are living with fire and the strategies that we have been using and the ones that we need to move forward into the future. So this is a slide that basically is showing a map that indicates the polygons or areas of fires from 1973 to 2019, which is a lot of fire and increasing amounts of fire. However, there are some studies and work that has looked at historically, if we looked at, like, say, there's one study that looks at between 1984 that mapped wildfires basically, and then compared that to what we would expect to see from the historical fire regime in Washington of forests. And from 1984 to 2014, we calculated basically that there's a 500,000 acre deficit of actually good fire or fire in the state. So I know it does feel like a lot of fire, but just that gives you some context of historically really how much Native Americans people were living and thriving in this ecosystem in the amount of fire. It thinks it'd be very difficult to move forward and think that we could survive with that much fire in our current state So really looking at how we do adapt and think about fire moving forward. And especially thinking from the context of now we have this perfect storm of how we have managed a lot of the ecosystems and the conditions of fuel and the relationship of fire now that create more higher severity fire and larger fires, or certainly higher severity fires. And now we have, with a warming climate, longer fire seasons, more intensity relative to heat, the elements that basically push more fire. So those two things coming together create real challenges for us in how we live with fire and think about how we live with fire moving forward. This is an example of that NASA put together relative of warming and of the climate, and clearly as you have warmer temperatures, you have less snow. The predictions are we'll have similar amounts of rain in the Cascades, but less snow in the sense of the length of the season. If you think about snow drying out in the mountains, that means the fuel is going to dry out faster, right, and be more available for fire as we move forward. So those are the types of relationships that we're looking at in the sense of basically more fuels more often being available to fire that creates challenges with how we have developed strategies of how we live with fire moving forward. Other studies are showing, and they're proving out that expectations in the sense of models, in the sense of looking at with this temperature change and change in climate, how much more fire we're going to see. So in the Central Cascades forests, up to quadrupling the amount of acres in fire that we're likely to see moving forward over the next 3 to 4 decades, and at least doubling in our shrub steppe ecosystems in the Columbia Plateau. So those are the challenges that I think we really are looking at facing in the sense of how we adapt and engage fire in the future. Of course, there's this element too of how do people interact in places, right, that are with available fuels. So often where we build, right, our homes, our towns, and so forth, often called the wildland urban interface, how we live in that space of from our urban centers, downtowns, too, as we get out to more flammable fuels. What is the relationship between structures and wildfire? The other component is a lot of people, I think that, right, their house is going to burn as a fire, comes across the ground, comes to your house and burns the house down. But in most situations, 85% of house fires are actually created from an ember. Fire in a forest or shrub steppe system with high winds can carry a hot ember up to 3 miles and land on a home and start a fire. So what is this interaction between how we're living in this space in the front country, and then thinking as we move more into wildlands, how are we living and engaging fire? This is a map that summarizes current, not a future, but our current basically fire risk in Washington as it's mapped in areas that have high probability of ignition and fire spread in Washington. Our Yakima County area is pretty high up there in the sense of probability of large fires, which is our experience. And I think if you've lived in Yakima for a long time, we're also seeing how that's changing over the last 3 to 4 decades. We're seeing more and more fire in Yakima County. A lot of the great work that's happened at the Washington Resource Conservation Development Council through their fire adapted communities program, really thinking about engaging different parts of the landscape, thinking about resilient landscapes. How do we work in large landscapes across ownerships across. Fire doesn't see boundaries. How do we, or right, wildlife or recreation? Clearly, there's some more issues there for boundaries. But how do we engage in thinking about, especially with fire, across ownerships in large landscapes of unbuilt places, and then in communities, what role can community members take in the sense of preparing for wildfire, from either work on their homes in the sense that they make them more fire resistant, to some field reduction around their homes, to thinking about how might you safely leave if you needed to, in the sense of with a fire and need to evacuate. So to more effective response, how do we work? We've had a strategy that's been very effective of fire suppression. How do we think about shifting that a bit in the sense of, yes, what are the different things community members can do? How can we better interact with forested and shrub systems in the sense of creating healthier systems from a restoration perspective, another management perspective, and with the role of fire in those systems, to really support more effective response. So those different areas of more effective response, working in larger landscapes and communities, all have a role in the sense of engaging fire in working to really have better outcomes and meet the goals of communities in place. So both in thinking about before, during, and after fire. So that's end of the presentation I have, and I think Kara will talk a little bit more about one of the elements of that gives some context of thinking of how, thinking about different strategies, the role of fire in landscapes, and how we might engage moving forward. A very important component as part of this solution is how do we better manage fire or use fire to meet both ecological goals and also community and work to reduce fire risk in communities. And so Kara is going to talk a bit more specifically about the role of prescribed fire and some of the work that she's engaged in. Let's see. Thank you.
Thank you, Reese, and bear with me a second while I make this work as we change this up. Hopefully that works for everybody. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. Again, Kara Karboski. In addition to working at the RCMD, I coordinate the Washington Prescribed Fire Council. And so a big part of my job, or every day part of my job, is around prescribed fire. So I'm happy to be here today to talk a little bit more about my work. And I think Reese set up a really good, the context as far as, fire is a natural part of a lot of the landscapes that are in Washington. And there are a lot of things that we're doing to better adapt, to better live with fire. And prescribed fire is one of those tools. So prescribed fire or controlled burning is, intentionally using fire, setting fire to a landscape to meet specific objectives, right? And it's used in a way where we control where, when, how, and why, we're doing this work. And much to the same reasons that, Reese talked about, fire's natural role, prescribed fire has some of those same objectives, right? Wildfire risk reduction, removing fuels so that when future fires come through, there's less fuel for it to burn. Ecological restoration, which Reese outlined many of the reasons that we do that, as well as cultural benefits. So tribes using fire to meet their own needs. So for some examples of that might be using fire to manage huckleberry stands, or to invigorate the growth of certain species of grasses, or for basket weaving materials, or open up places for game, things like that. So a long history in the world of using fire as a tool, but in this in this area, well, I'm based in Olympia, but in Yakima and Olympia, a long history of using fire for the indigenous peoples that live and still live in these areas and still use fire. And you know, fire, it can be, these are the reasons why we might use fire, and it can be a little scary, right? Because we've all seen and clearly had impacts from smoke, as well as just, you know, fire can be destructive. But it's also like removing water from some of these ecosystems and how important it is, and the way that it's disrupted the way these ecosystems function and the kind of health that they're in. So, you know, that's one of, as Reese set up, you know, we need to learn to live with fire. So I just have some photos, you know, just to show you all, and hopefully they can help paint the picture of the work that we're doing in Washington and where we're trying to go. This is a picture of a burn in just north of Leavenworth, Washington. As we did a burn with the Forest Service as part of our prescribed fire training exchange, as Ryan mentioned. And you can see one side that has been burned just the day before and the side that wasn't burned. And you can still see after the implementation of the burn, you know, shrubs actually still in pretty good shape, and overstory the trees, like right, these, you know, it's not all burned over, right? It's burning the surface fuels, a lot of that pine litter and grasses away in this instance. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how a prescribed burn, just to give a little context of what like a prescribed burn is and how it's actually implemented. I feel like if you haven't been out there, it might seem like a little bit of a black box or a bit of an unknown. And so, you know, the actual burn part of a prescribed burn, the part where, you know, fire practitioners or folks are actually putting fire on the landscape, is actually a really small part of the work that happens. You know, there's a lot of planning that goes into the work, you know, identifying what are our goals? Why are we out here doing this? What type of safety precautions do we need to have? What about contingency plans, communications? We have a whole, to consider kind of the wind direction that we need to burn this area in to limit smoke impacts. We need to think about what's the temperature range when it's acceptable to do this work. What about the relative humidity? So thinking about all of those elements that's going to affect our burn, all of that is in a burn, what we call a burn plan. But essentially they can be super complex or they can be really simple. But they're all kind of doing that same thing of like, yeah, we have got a plan. We're going in here and we've done our thinking, we have a plan. There's a whole element of permitting, right? So there's laws that say how we can do this work and when we can do it, and who's responsible for it. And we have to, you know, submit a permit and that says like, these are the restrictions, right? And the things that we need to do to be able to do this work. You have to prep the area to burn. So in this picture, you can see that this line that's going up, you know, through splitting this picture in two is what we call a control line. Now this is a pretty small control line, but it was effective at its job with the firefighters that were working on this. And so basically we'll construct lines where we want fire on one side and we don't want fire on the other, right? And doing other such things like getting water resources out there, line hose along these units, hose, you know, we can fill with water and spray on things. And so prepping the area, so we're getting ready. Organizing all the people and equipment that we need to be able to do this work, super important. Talking about what we're going to do to the community, to our partners, to people who live nearby, communicating why we're doing this and where we're doing this and when. Really, really important. You have to get approval on the day, at least in Washington State, you have to get approval to burn from an air quality perspective, right? So if the air quality conditions aren't favorable to your burn and it's going to impact a community, you know, there's regulatory agencies that oversee that and will say that you can't burn. So there's like several layers, right, of all of this. And then finally, we get an opportunity to burn. And I got I think a cool picture here. Oh, I've got another nice picture. That's this is after a prescribed burn. This is 1 year actually after a burn. Not in the same area as the previous photo, but in this is actually near Lake Wenatchee, near Plain, Washington. This is 1 year post burn, and looking pretty good. Clearly, another burn. This is an area around Olympia where you can see that that burns frequently, and you can see plants, wildlife thriving under this environment, right? Frequently, this burns almost every year, and yet this is taken in the spring. This will burn every summer almost, and clearly it's thriving. So this is the picture I thought it was going to be next. This is of a prescribed burn also around Olympia. And I wanted to show you this picture because I think it does a good job of showing kind of what this looks like on the ground, and showing, clearly shows where they were trying to burn and where they're controlling the fire. And so this is what it might actually look like. They'll start in one corner, in the upper left-hand corner is where they started, and they'll slowly make their way down, lighting fire. And this will be a backing fire, right? So they don't want it to go fast. They don't want a ripping head fire, right? They're going to control this on what they call the control lines on either side of this image, right? There's a road on the other side, and then this is an actual mow line on the bottom side of the picture. And they'll slowly make their way. Wind is blowing to the left in this image, and so the fire is backing down, and they're helping bring that fire down slowly. After the burn is completed, they'll conduct some what we call mop up. That's a wildfire term, where you go through and start putting little fires out, right? Starting making sure everything's going to stay where we want it to stay. And then patrol and monitoring. So continue to check in to make sure that this burn is where we want it to be, that it's not going anywhere, that it's staying where we want it to be, as well as monitor. So an important part is, did we set out to meet the objectives that we said we would? So thinking about before and then after, did we meet the objectives of what we were trying to set out to do? So that's really what a burn looks like. And like I said, the actual burn part, it could be an hour or two. Sometimes it can take a couple days, but generally the planning, all that prep work, it takes a long time, and a lot of thought goes into this work prior to it starting. I want to talk a little bit about, where prescribed fire happens in Washington, which is, really everywhere. Each of these kind of regions that this is a kind of a draft map of different prescribed fire regions, but, fire and prescribed burning is happening in each of these regions. From the coastal area where the Quinault Indian Nation has conducted some burns to, like I said, around Olympia, up to the San Juans, clearly, in the Central Cascades, the dry forest, the Forest Service does quite a bit of burning, and kind of moving out from there into more oak woodland type environments. Northeast Washington and the Colville National Forest and all the federal partners up there do prescribed burning, and then down in the southeast corner of the Blue Mountains, right? So fire is a part of this whole area. Prescribed fire is a part of it as well. And this is happening by, like I said, our federal partners, the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. All those folks are doing burning, as well as some of our state agencies and tribes. Yakima Nation has a prescribed burn program, for example. And then there's a small amount that's happening, and it's growing on private lands and county and municipal lands. And really, when we look at the picture of prescribed fire in Washington, it's predominantly happening by agencies, by the Forest Service primarily, and by our tribal, the Colville National the Colville tribe, the Yakima Nation, Spokane tribe, all conduct a lot of prescribed burning. And it's not happening so much in other parts. And so that's one of the things that the Prescribed Fire Council is looking into. How can we support burning happening, not just on federal lands, but on lands that are closer to communities that are owned by private landowners, that are owned by cities and counties? How can we start to support the work happening there? For those that look and care about these things, I think when we look at the state of prescribed fire, these days in Washington, we're not doing enough, and we feel like we could be doing a lot more, and particularly relative to the amount of wildfire that we're having. We think we could, by doing more, we could have better outcomes for wildfire and better outcomes for communities. And so that's where the work of the Washington Prescribed Fire Council comes in. And as the coordinator for that group, and Reese is treasurer, has been, former chair of the council. We're really a coalition of people, of agencies and organizations and individuals from across the state who are interested and have a stake in prescribed fire. And looking to, our goal is to expand the safe use of prescribed fire across Washington. And so we've got, our coalition is made up of federal agencies, of state agencies, of burners, but also regulatory agencies, land managers, foresters, fire departments, scientists, et cetera. Anyone who really has a stake in this work. And a lot of what we are trying to do is identify and address barriers and identify those roadblocks to implementing more prescribed fire. Some of these things are, policies and laws that regulate and limit when and where burns can happen. And those laws are important, to be clear. They're really important, but there's kind of a push and pull of like, we want to do more prescribed fire. What are the pathways forward to being able to do that within policy? And some of those laws and regulations are to protect us, protect our health, but finding ways in which we can start to work to live more with fire and have more of it while still protecting people's health and protecting, fire risk and things like that. One of our challenges is the resource, knowledge, and people to do the work. The money for agencies, but the funding and the resources for private landowners as well to do this work, and knowing how to do this work. It kind of spans all everyone who's trying to do this work, right? Resources, knowledge, and people, really, really crucial, and can be a limiting factor sometimes. For our agencies, for the federal and state agencies, sometimes there's trade-offs or priorities in agencies. And so I think, sometimes leadership, or there might just be disincentives to doing this work. And I think particularly we can see some of these challenges with wildfire season as we all know, wildfire season getting longer, feeling the effects of that. And wildfire season pushing into where we would usually have our burn season. So looking into late, into fall, into September, when historically our federal agencies, for example, would have been burning, they're now fighting fire. And so, but we still have, come October, there's going to be rain and it's going to limit people's ability to do burn. So that availability to actually do the burn is getting narrower as well. And so there becomes trade-offs in the work that we're doing. Clearly we need to put fires out. How can we also be, conducting prescribed fires as well? Weather and climate is one of those challenges that's everywhere, and it just really depends year to year and day to day what the weather is going to be like. But that can be a significant challenge as we're trying to do work. And climate change and changing climate factors are going to impact that in several different ways. But that's definitely something that is a challenge for moving forward prescribed fire. And then for, thinking about for people who are not a federal agency, who are not professional firefighters, who, where do you start if you wanted to do a prescribed burn on your property? Where do you go? And I think that's a really, one thing that the Prescribed Fire Council is really interested in. How can we help private landowners? How can we help cities and counties and people who haven't historically been professional firefighters? How can we start moving towards, using fire as a tool? We don't need to necessarily be wildland firefighters to be able to use fire, right? And so how can we start to build up the skills and have those resources and connect people to be able to do this work more often? And one of the ways that we try to do that is, the council, through our prescribed fire training exchanges, like Ryan mentioned previously, we're trying to start to work with private landowners to conduct burns. And we're trying to support private landowners where we can in doing that planning work that I mentioned, and bringing in resources and people to help do the burns and start to build that, that capacity and knowledge locally within communities so that they can do it themselves, which I think is pretty critical, right? I think, the community knows what's most important to them, and empowering communities to do this work is critical. So how can we, you know, in the RCND and the Washington Prescribed Fire Council, I think one of our major paths forward to more prescribed fire is coordinating that, coordinating and supporting that local capacity to meet local objectives and needs around prescribed fire, and really empowering everyone, building that understanding and that knowledge and those connections within communities to and relationships to be able to do this work together. And we've seen how some of this work has started to happen in communities in California. They started what are called prescribed burn associations, which is essentially a nice term for neighbors helping neighbors, right? So, and this is a very much a blue jeans operation. You know, landowners come together. Someone's got a truck, and someone else has got, you know, some drip torches, which is this tool that you see this firefighter carrying in this photo. They all come together and they share things and they get the work done. And then they go to someone else's property and they share resources and get the work done. And it's, like I said, neighbors helping neighbors situation. So thinking about how we might be able to do that more often. And like Cy mentioned, you know, at the beginning of this, you know, Cowiche Canyon Conservancy is working with the city of Yakima and others, other, you know, critical partners to conduct a burn on Conservancy land. And that's part of what, we're, you know, in our way, how can we help support and connect these opportunities? Have more, you know, see more, maybe more prescribed burns after this first successful one on Conservancy property or with others in different communities across Washington. So that's a lot of the work that we're trying to move forward and we're trying to do is build those pathways for private landowners and for everyone to be able to implement prescribed fire. Where do I go? I want to do a burn. How do I do it? Well, we're working towards those solutions. We're working towards bringing everyone together to build that work. I have, that's pretty much where I've got a couple of photos that I think I'll flip through just to kind of just show you a little bit more. It's always fun to share. I have a lot of photos of prescribed fire, so it's always fun to share some more of them to give you kind of an idea of what's happening. So I'll just go through and share. This is actually the one of the Prescribed Fire Council meetings, and this is really just to show that it's a group of people coming together to talk about work and figure out solutions, like I said. And sometimes we meet together on cold March days. This was from a couple of years ago, 2019, I actually think. And this is at an area in South Central, Klickitat County. This is the Mount Adams Resource Stewards. They manage a community forest down near Glenwood, Washington, and this is an area where they have conducted some restoration work, including prescribed fire. So we were going out there and checking out the work that they were doing. Important part of this work is just everyone getting together and talking, right? That's pretty critical. This is a prescribed burn. We've been doing a lot of work around Roslyn, Washington, and Cle Elum, and so this is actually a burn from 2017, and you can see in the middle of the screen there, that's Roslyn. It's the city of Roslyn. This is the first burn we conducted in coordination with partners there, including fire departments, the Nature Conservancy, a lot of folks coming together to make this happen. And we've been working in this area ever since. So every fall we've been doing burning in this area, building up, and this is really a community risk reduction project, trying to limit future fires coming into the city of Roslyn. And so we've been conducting burns, around up on the ridge, did quite a bit of work last fall as well. And so we're slowly building up this area around this community that has had prescribed fire. The fuels are reduced because we're returning fire, and we're building up an area where we can return fire at a regular interval like it normally would have done. And this is a community project, right? The community we kind of helped bring everyone together and kind of those like spark, and help bring resources in when people couldn't get resources. But now we're in a situation where the community's taking this on. The Roslyn Fire Department has a fuels crew, and the city of Roslyn has a fuels crew, and the local fire departments are involved, and they're really doing a lot of work here to help make this happen. This is, another prescribed burn around Olympia. And so you can see, this is a more of a grass type burn. That green brush that's sticking up is Scotch broom, and that's an invasive, non-native invasive plant, and it's really susceptible to, it doesn't do well with fire. So it's really, fires works really well in getting rid of that and restoring these prairies. This was also from this last fall. I mentioned we did some burning. This is in the Roslyn Urban Forest, which is runs up into the city of Roslyn. We burned, not this particular burn, but one of the other burns, burned, directly down into town, down to town, about 50 feet to town. Lots of partners here to make this successful again, fire department, everyone involved to make this a success. Some more fire photos. I just can't help myself. Sorry. I said I shouldn't do too many photos, and then I just they're just fun. And I'll just leave with this one, right? So it's always a good day. Folks like to get out there, and it feels satisfying to learn to see how fire interacts in the environment, to learn about the way that fire does its thing, and the folks that get out there and do this work are really enjoying themselves and enjoy learning and enjoy, I think that a job well done at the end of the day. Hard work, but it's fun. So I will leave it with that. Thank you all. And that's the end of my presentation.